Thank you very much, David, for that extraordinarily kind and generous introduction. And David was saying how witty I am. Well, I'd be feeling a damn sight wittier if I hadn't had my lecture behind me. So I shall now have to try and remember bits of it, and otherwise we will expand or contract, as the case may be, what might have been in it. But let me say, first of all, of course, it's a very bittersweet occasion as far as I'm concerned. It's obviously the first time I'm giving the Diarmuid Whelan Memorial Lecture. Diarmuid was my PhD student, and after that he had his office right beside mine. The doors were beside each other, and he was in and out of mine, I was in and out of his, and he was incredibly generous with anything he found that he thought might be of interest to me. Well, we all know what happened, and I still find it very hard to come to terms with the sheer poignancy of the recollection. Because I was in America at the time, I got over here the day afterwards, and he's just such a loss, and I can say no more than that. But his memory certainly recurs to me time and time again, and anybody who knows my memory knows that anybody who can come back into it time and time again knows they must have a very special place in it. So it is a great honour for me to be able to give this lecture, even though I wish to God, in a way, there was no reason to give it at this particular stage. Now, beyond that, I want to thank David for his generosity of words here this evening, and his generosity in inviting me to give the lecture. And I do want to pay a very belated public thank you to the History Department in UCC, where I spent many, many years, more I think than perhaps some of them might have wished. I look back, I have to say fondly, because as time goes by, one becomes ever more aware of what one is missing and what one is losing, which one isn't always equally conscious of at the time. So let me turn to the scope of the talk, the essence of the talk, or what I will not now be saying in as inevitably polished a manner as I would have been. But the first thing I remind, the last time I was on this platform, we were giving an honorary doctorate to Roy Keane. It was obviously his first time also being in this type of milieu, shall we say, but I was so impressed, it still lingers in my mind because he still has his few scraps here and there. There must have been 500 young kids outside. There was a rope right around the quad, and they were just lined, there were 2 or 3 rows behind him. He went, and I think he signed autographs for a couple of hours afterwards. It was an extraordinary exhibition of, if you like, participation in where he probably felt more at home in some respects than he did up here. But I will never forget that. I don't know him, by the way, so this is not a puff for him or anything like that. I was just so impressed by the spontaneity and the graciousness with which it was done. So whenever I see him spouting off, and you can always still see him spouting off from time to time on television, that always comes back to me. Now, that's nothing to do with 1916. What I'm going to do here, I'm not going to go through sort of a historical text, and this wasn't even in the text that is actually there, reconstructing the background to 1916, maybe even rehashing what we all know. I'm going to ask a couple of questions about what we don't know. And I did quite a bit of work in 1916, 7 or 8 years ago. I haven't worked on it since. I'm going to be doing a lot of work over the next year. And here I'm trying out some of the first thoughts that have come into my mind about questions we might ask and how we might approach what happened, trying to understand what happened, why it happened in the context, how it happened. I'm not bothered basically about attitudes towards 1916 today. There's lots of stuff in the Irish Times. There are people spouting off about their views on it, etc., etc., etc. Some of whom actually know something about it. But I'm not concerned about that as such. What I'm trying to do is to ask, how should historians approach this central event in the history of modern Ireland? Whether one likes it being a central event or not is a different matter. It is a central event. It's a seminal event in many ways, and it has to be engaged with and has to be addressed. And the problem, which is not exactly an original observation, the problem obviously is hindsight. We know what came afterwards. It's the great bane of the historian not to be able to position ourselves looking forward, not knowing what came next, because it makes it very difficult to to give fair dues to the minds of those who anticipated a different future, or who had their views of what ought to happen, including those that were involved in making other things happen, because nothing works out as any of them expect. And much of the writing about 1916 has found it very difficult to sort of forget what came next, whatever they might think of it, good or bad, wise or foolish, etc., and to position themselves when trying to evaluate the quality of decision making, when trying to evaluate the personalities, making decisions under intense pressure on Easter Sunday 1916, to evaluate what they thought they were looking towards, because obviously what that was also probably didn't work out the way most of them expected. The huge problem for historians is we know what came next. And only a truly great historian can, in effect, detach himself or herself from the knowledge of what came next and see it through the eyes of the decision makers who did not know what was coming next, and who would obviously have done different things, at least in a number of cases, if they actually knew what the consequences of what they did was going to be, because obviously in a lot of cases it doesn't work out exactly as they anticipate. For me, it's always a test of the history. The first question we ask is not what do I know about this, what do I think about this, is why do I think what I think about this? And that's pushing ourselves back to self-examination, which is a very purgative activity. It's perhaps just whether none of us can do it perfectly, or we would shrivel, I suspect, in the light of what we see. Anyway, let me get back to asking a couple of questions which I think should loom a bit more in terms of trying to understand. I'm not now talking about consequences. Consequences are a matter of opinion in many respects, and those opinions are determined in large measure by who we are today, where we come from. They're determined by our experience rather than by the experience of those we're dealing with. So the question I'm putting is trying to position myself in that room in Liberty Hall on Easter Sunday, 1916, where news of the sinking of the Ode, of the loss of the expected guns has arrived, where it is not now going to be the full rising planned in Dublin, and whatever was planned, insofar as was planned, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what exactly was planned beyond Dublin, what do you do? What do you do? Basically, the plans you've been working on for the best part of a year, they have collapsed. And you know that you're going to be within a couple of days picked up, basically. So how do you adjust to the sliver of time between now, when things have gone so badly wrong, and when you can begin paying the price, or some price for that? We know nothing about what was said directly by anybody at that meeting. All we know is they decided to go ahead the following day, and then Easter week followed. And they go ahead with a number of decisions, or confirmation of decisions taken. It's very interesting to read Kathleen Clark, Tom Clark's widow, who was a tough woman, and she had to be. She was always incandescent that Pearse, and not her husband, was President of the Republic and was Commander-in-Chief. Why is her husband, who is the senior member of that group, who brought Pearse into the IRB, who is clearly, leaving all those things aside, is clearly the key figure in bringing the IRB to a condition in which they could think of mounting a potentially serious rising. Tom Clark had come back from America 7 or 8 years before. He'd worked with John Devine in America. After going there, after spending some years in Ireland, after getting out of jail, where he had suffered hideously. And he's the one who actually brings Pearse into the IRB, much against the wishes of many others, because Pearse was brought into the IRB in December 1913, and at that stage he was still known more as an intellectual, a school teacher, a writer, former editor of Clive Sullish, but a literary type, not of the warp and woof or the core of the IRB type, not as a potentially hard, tough rebel. What is Tom bringing him in, insisting on bringing him in, when in fact he has done very little? Yes, he's given some very interesting speeches. He has written some Very interesting stuff. He's edited in Clive Sullish, but we've never thought of him as being one of us in that particular sense. He's been too prone to compromise. He's been too prone to trying to bring everybody along who might have something to contribute towards an Irish Ireland movement. He does not strike us as a rebel type. So to have him come in late 13 and not merely become very senior very quickly, very influential very quickly in the IRB and the plans for the Rising, but to then be nominated as the President and Commander-in-Chief. One can understand, I dare say, Kathleen Clarke's resentment, which she did not refrain from expressing, and it's a very good question, as a matter of fact. Why should somebody who was such a recent recruit to the IRB take seniority, in a sense, over the man who was essentially responsible, for A, for bringing him in, and B, for getting the IRB to where it was? And there's an interesting piece in her memoirs about when Tom Clarke comes home a week before the Rising and says, or more than a week before the Rising, and says that when the proclamation is finalised, his will be the first name on it, which it is. And her answer, and one can begin talking then about the aspirations of the type of family she came from, etc. That means you'll be president, right? And the response recorded, which I suppose it does, from which I have since deduced, given what happened, is that he knew damn well he wasn't going to be president, had agreed he wouldn't be president, because had he wanted it, he would certainly have got it from that group, but he wanted Pearse. So he was not going to have a row with the wife, whose capacity for rowing I'm sure he had plenty of experience of, and he plumb asked her. But why would Clarke want Pearse as president? Why would any of them want Pearse as president? Yes, there had been some fiery speeches and some fiery writings, and there had been the Donovan Rossa, the speech over the grave, etc., which had enhanced his number of admirers considerably. But when you think of it, it is very odd that somebody who comes in so relatively late to that inner circle, who's been distrusted by many of the people close to that inner circle, should actually, in a sense, leapfrog them all in their own hierarchy and be president. Now, I don't know the answer. They're not writing down explanations for these things in the GPO. My surmise, however, is this, and it set me thinking along a line which I haven't seen discussed much, but I think probably should be, and I will try and do some of it myself if I can. The Rising was, of course, Easter Monday. It wasn't Easter Sunday. So when they're making their disposition, they're not thinking of an Easter Monday Rising, they're thinking of an Easter Sunday Rising. And the Easter Sunday Rising was intended to be on a much more ambitious scale than the Easter Monday Rising. The Easter Monday Rising is not Easter Sunday postponed by one day. It's simply a different rising. That means that had Easter Sunday worked out, they would have, as I see it, been reckoning on being able to last a lot longer. They'd been able to see themselves lasting long enough to be able to get messages out to the country and to the wider world. And for that, they need an outstanding communicator. And their outstanding communicator is Pearse. So they're thinking about who we position in what, with what responsibility, seems to me to be determined by factors that turned out at very, very short notice to be invalid. But they're not now going to start on a reconstruction of order, the pecking order, etc., etc. So I think we have to spend a lot more time thinking about what happens in that very short term in trying to adjust to the devastating news that the old is gone. The guns aren't there. Whatever chance there is of a significant rising in Dublin, and what was going to happen throughout the country looks very wobbly, because that seems to have been, as far as one can tell, was not systematically planned. There were bits and pieces, the line of the Shannon, all that sort of stuff, Lee Mellows and whatnot. But as far as one can tell, and maybe something will turn up which shows that in fact more thought had gone into it, this was essentially a Dublin-driven rising in terms of thinking about what's going to happen, what's most important. But if the Dublin rising turned out to be the Easter Sunday rising, then it was going to be almost certainly a much longer rising, whatever the ultimate consequences of the rebellion. And that meant that it was not going to be simply crushed in a few days, however valiant the resistance, etc., however much the eyes of part of the world were on it. And a lot of New York guys were on it. The New York Times, the week after the rising, the week after the surrender, is actually giving quite a lot of attention to what's happening in Dublin, and is asking, it's condemning it, but it's asking for no executions. So the impact in the uncensored part of the world that's paying attention, which means a lot of Irish America and a lot of spillover from Irish America in an American presidential election year, is very different from what's happening in Ireland, where there is virtually universal condemnation in the media. Now, when I say virtually universal condemnation, I draw a distinction between those who are coming from purely home rule perspective and are condemning it out of hand as treachery to home rule, as a move to undermine home rule, and those number of papers, of which there are a number, they're a minority, which are actually sympathetic to the objectives, but are saying this is crazy. This is no way of achieving it. And that's what you will find during Easter week. When you begin getting into the following week, you can detect a significant shift of tone, which is still condemning the rising, but is also condemning the executions. And you begin sensing that shift of perspective very quickly. I would say still in the week afterwards, not in a majority of papers, which are still home rule dominated, but in a sufficient number to say something is happening here. That is, once the executions begin, that is building on, I would say, a suppressed aspiration in those circles the previous week, but was not expressed because the whole thing appeared to be crazy. So it is quite possible, it seems to me, it's the best explanation I can think of, and maybe it doesn't carry weight, that the reason that Pearse is where he is and becomes iconic in terms of the rising is because the plan for the rising was a different plan than the one that actually they found themselves, if you like, substituting for it when the news arrives that they're not going to have the weaponry that they assumed they were going to have. Possibly, I suspect, wrongly even in Dublin, but that's a matter of planning at that stage. Now, Pearse becoming the spokesperson for the rising means that the messages going out in the course of Easter week itself are obviously highly propagandistic messages. They would probably be coming from anybody, but he had a particular skill in that direction. So it's not until the very end that they're losing. And Pearse spends his own time, I suspect he didn't fire a shot during in the GPO, he spends his own time composing messages which are meant to last. Where the appointment really matters, however, it seems to me, where the appointment really matters, and this sort of area has not been explored at all, and it's quite possible that no exploration is possible, is in the decision to surrender. Tom Clark did not want to surrender. Tom Clark wanted to fight to the end. Now, if you fight to the end in the GPO, or even sort of down Moore Street, etc., at the end of the week, you're going to be killed. That's what you're there for. And the job of the other side will be to kill you. That's what it's about. So it seems to me that it is quite possible that Pearse's calculation in bringing the others of the signatories with him and in a sense isolating Clark in terms of what do we do next is based on a calculation that this in effect has been a public relations exercise from the beginning. How do we optimize the returns on that public relation? Of course, it's also a killing exercise in both directions. And they know, and certainly Pearse himself knows he's going to be executed. He can't have been thinking of anything else. I suspect he's hoping his brother will not be executed, etc., etc. It's obviously unprovable, but one has to ask, why does it work out like this? And what is the reasoning behind the various decisions taken, and in particular, what is Clark's position? Because if Clark had wanted to be president, I have no doubt in my mind that he would have been. Clark was an extraordinary personality, and he did far more than anybody else to bring the IRB back into real life and to bring the organisation and the rising to the pitch where it could have a chance of reasonable success. Up to a point, it would be crushed anyway unless international politics played otherwise. But it's the only reason I can think of, and I would be very grateful for anybody in the audience who can come up with alternative reasoning, because more and more of my own time is beginning to try and think around how do we reconstruct the thought processes before Easter Saturday / Easter Sunday? How do we step back from Easter Monday and try and reconstruct their thinking before they knew what was going to happen? Which is an ultimate test for the historian. Now, I may have got the answer all wrong, but it's a question that has to be asked. But historians, we almost, I won't say take for granted, but we just assume this is what happened, this is what we've got to explain, in a sense, and we go on into Easter week. So that is, to me, one of the big question marks over how do historians approach what actually happened, knowing only what the signatories, the other leaders knew at the time they were making the decisions. Now, I would add that if one wants to build, and this may be a very fragile foundation on which to build it, if one wants to build further thinking, I'm not asking anybody to accept what I'm saying, by the way, in terms of, because I don't have evidence for that, obviously. I'm trying to surmise what is the most plausible balance of probabilities. If they had fought on, pretty certainly, the big majority would have been killed. If they insisted on keeping firing, you're going to keep firing back at them. That could have meant that the GPO garrison as a whole would have been virtually wiped out, including quite possibly Michael Collins. It could have meant that De Valera would have been killed in action. You don't know what would have happened in those circumstances, but could have happened. That could have happened. It was pure chance he wasn't executed, because Wiley told Maxwell that he's not sufficiently important to be shot, which was, at the time, was probably actually quite right, but became a bad judgment call in the light of the following 50 years. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of might-have-beens, it seems to me, attaching to what's happening over a very short period that the historiography has not yet begun to try to address, irrespective of what conclusion it wants to come to. But there are questions that have to be addressed. And that, it seems to me, is where we need partly to go at any rate, to try and follow through on the balances of probabilities. Who knows what public opinion would have been like? I'll hazard no guesses what would have been like if in fact the fight had gone on. It may well have been simply, well, yes, there's not just the leaders got killed, a lot got killed, there's nobody else there now who's going to matter a damn. So let's do the best deal we can with whatever the alternative might be. But it does seem to me that in looking at the build-up to 1916, to looking at the previous number of years, to looking, and I'll come back to him in a moment, and I wish I had my quotations here, looking at Pearse coming up to December 1913, when he takes the step of becoming an IRB man, that there are a lot of futures still out there. A lot of futures in terms of Pearse himself, a lot of futures in terms of the IRB, and probably futures of post-Easter, a post-non-rising Easter. In other words, we have to begin, as I see it, to reconstruct the balance of probabilities as seen from before what we know happened. Because what we know happened was the chance of a particular moment or moments. It wasn't preordained in almost any aspect of it. It depends on the individual decisions of a small number of people, and whether it's in Dublin or whether it's with the Ode. Now, what would have happened if the Ode's guns had landed? Who knows, because as far as I can see, the plans were not particularly professional for what happens afterwards. But if a rising is what they thought it was going to be, whatever exactly that was, then we're looking at a different scenario. We're also looking at a potentially different scenario if it lasts longer, and a longer might be a matter of weeks. But what happens in terms of British responses? Is it go for the kill as quickly as possible because whatever else happens we have to smash that? Or, particularly in the light of being an American presidential year and Woodrow Wilson focusing on keeping America out of the war, do we try and arrange some sort of modus vivendi? I find it very hard myself, I have to say, to think any modus vivendi would have made sense from a British perspective. But you're into a new balance of possibilities than in the face of what actually happened, which when you think of it, I think, I use a favourite phrase of my wife, which implies that she thinks I don't think of it often enough, obviously. When you think of it, how does the British government react in the face of a more formidable rising? Which was what was intended. Maybe exactly the same thing would have happened. But historians have to go back behind what actually happened to asking what is what's the trajectory of expectations over the previous few days. Now, having said that, I do want to say that I think Clark brought Pearse into the IRB largely, at least, because of his perception of Pearse's skills as a communicator. That was the added value Pearse brought to the IRB as of December 1913. He was in a class of his own as a communicator. Now, he bored some people stiff, etc., but in general terms, Pearse was a skillful communicator. Clark selected him to do the O'Donovan Rossa, the address over the grave, and he seems to allow, which he could have stopped at any time along the way, to allow Pearse to accumulate increasing authority, increasing responsibility, increasing planning responsibility as the IRB belatedly gets around to thinking about having a rising. Well, I say belatedly because when you look at the chronology, they decide in September 1914, 1 month into the war, that they will have a rising. The phrase is before the end of the war. But nobody knows how long the war is going to last. Now, there is a widespread view that it might be over by Christmas. Well, if you're planning on having a rising as of September 1914 and having a rising before Christmas, you have a lot of work to do very quickly. And it goes on, and okay, the feeling may have come, this thing is going to drag on for quite some time, which of course is what happened. But the first phrase, to plan in September 14 for a rising before the end of the war, either they have extraordinary predictive capacity, or this is virtually a rhetorical statement. So again, once one begins looking closely at what's actually happening on the ground, as you think from the way things are in a way romanticized retrospectively, it puts requires a lot of emphasis to be placed on the precise decision-making mechanisms about what will happen, when it will happen, and how can it have maximum effect. So I think there's a lot of digging still to be done, if it can be done with the sources available, to be done on exactly what's going through the minds of the main planners, the main organisers, between September 14 and the actual rising in April 16. And of course, there was a possibility, or that it was thought there was to be a possibility of a rising the previous September if the sought for German guns had arrived by then. Frankly, I have very little idea what a rising in September 1915 might have delivered or might not have delivered, how it would have been planned, how far the country, as distinct from Dublin, and how much of Dublin could have been involved. But there's a lot of work to be done by historians, it seems to me, on trying to ascertain what are the alternative trajectories of what we all know happened, what they might have been in the light of expectations from the outset of the war. And that's a different type of history from simply proceeding from the beginning of the war down to the rising, as if in fact that's more or less a straight line, with a few hitches here and there, but not with fundamental subversion of the general approach. Now let me go back a bit further to Pearse, because I do want to stitch him into why, in fact, he became iconic, why he himself obviously wanted to be, or would have loved to have been, the sole victim of the executions, which would have allowed him, in his ego, and he had a considerable ego, to loom ever larger, obviously, than if you have 15 others sharing it, well, not fully sharing it. I think he went for surrender in the GPO, I think probably genuinely to save lives. I mean, this was the explanation given. He knew he wouldn't save his own. I think he thought he would save his brothers, and perhaps some others. If we try to put ourselves back into the position of somebody having to make that decision at that time, how do we try to reconstruct the thought processes they're likely to be having under that sort of immense pressure? So that's what I mean by having to reconstruct as far as we possibly can our being in the places of whoever we're talking about in those circumstances. To take it simply as one solid, unbroken block moving forward inexorably to the executions, one or two extra maybe than one had been thinking about, but that thing seems to me to be not to be breaking down the constituents of the historical process as they need to be broken down, which means you're keeping options open for the next step all the time, as distinct from seeing it as one unbroken slab from start to finish. Now we can think of what Irish history might have been, and who knows what it would have been like, if in fact most of those who survived hadn't survived. Who knows? Others may have emerged that we don't even know about at this particular stage. But let me go back a bit earlier to talking about the perception of the Rising, to some extent through Pearse, because Pearse is the most extensively written of them in terms of being editor of Clive Sullish, and in fact writer of most of Clive Sullish for 6 years. And the range of topics that he deals with, one can see why the IRB would have been, or many in the IRB, would have been very slow to think of him as an IRB man, because it is almost entirely what you might call cultural history. It's cultural history, obviously invoking the stages of Irish history, but it is basically the language, the significance of the language, the importance of the language as the core of identity, irrespective of what happens politically. And that comes out best of all, perhaps, in work edited by and recovered by Seamus O'Buachailla, who's a graduate of this college, the elder brother of Brandon O'Buachailla, who's also was a graduate of this college, God rest him. And Brandon is now 85. He's not in good health at all. But he's put down a text, which I have seen, reconstructing, some of it based on his own earlier writings, reconstructing Pearse's commitment to the cultural dimension, both as editor of Clive Sullish and subsequently. And what comes out of that has made me think more about Pearse qua Pearse and how he is working on the story of his life, in a sense, once he decides to try to join the IRB, which comes in 1913. 1913 is the hinge year. Up till then, including 1912, which everybody knows about, he speaks for Home Rule. When the Home Rule Bill is brought in, he speaks in O'Connell's in his favour, although warning that if we are betrayed this time, then it is war. But that's fairly standard, Pearse. There are, if our opportunity to take matters into our own hands in general, and to build on that, if that isn't conceded, if it's sabotaged in essence by Ulster, then Pearse's phrase, there will be a red war in Ireland. Pearse can never say a standard phrase without adding in a colourful adjective, usually in the case of blood, red, obviously. So it's very interesting to watch that. It takes 18 months after that still for him to actually be admitted to the IRB. His 1913 writings are a very different tone from the bulk of previous writings. They're all about, if you like, the hard line of revolution, the necessity to generate a revolutionary spirit. As distinct from, or as well as, because he never denied that he had supported Home Rule, he never denied, not only did he not deny, but in his final writings, he's pretty well stressing that he supported the Council's Bill. The Council's Bill, in contrast to the Home Rule Party. The Council Bill was 1907. It was a very watered-down version of Home Rule, and God knows Home Rule was a watered-down version enough of independence. Very watered down, because Campbell Bannerman had a majority, didn't need Home Rule votes, and as long as Home Rule votes were not needed by an English party, then you're not going to have movements, parliamentary movements towards Home Rule. But the Council's Bill, Pearse supported it, specifically on the grounds it gives us control over education. And education is far and away the most important building block in building Ireland a nation. Once we have control over that, we can begin to rear a new generation. Therefore, it's far more important than all the other things that loomed larger in the Home Rule political calculus. And Pearse was an extraordinarily committed educationist. There's no way one can go through how much time spent on writing educational tracts, talking about education, going to Belgium in 1905, which again Seamus O'Boole has written very interestingly. There's a book by him, I hope it's in there, I'm sure it is in the library here, on Pearse's month in Belgium, and particularly in Flanders, where for a 23-year-old, he's extraordinarily feted by senior education inspectors in Flanders. He goes to Flanders because he's looking at what he says is the revival of the Flemish language after it being very much in the back seat, first of all, obviously under, no, I shouldn't have put it like that, even under the Dutch rule down to 1830, but then once Belgium becomes Belgium and becomes in effect French, because it's a Wallonian control, Flanders suffers linguistically, it suffers in a variety of other ways, and only began clawing its way back late in the 19th century. So when Pearse is looking around for examples, real genuine examples of bringing a language from a subordinate position, even though of course far more Flemish is spoken in Flanders, even in a subordinate position than Irish was spoken in Ireland at the time, bringing that up and acquiring equal status for it, which is what he was looking for Irish, then Flanders recommends itself as a place to go to. Wales and Flanders are the two places that he's particularly interested in. What's striking about the Flanders visit is that he is strongly supported by the leading authorities on Flemish education. Here's a 23-year-old, as I say. Here you're getting quite senior school inspectors going with him into the classrooms, explaining how the teaching is done the way it is, why it's done the way it is, how language teaching is addressed, how the two languages are part and parcel of the education system. And Pearse was, of course, a bilingual idealist as far as Ireland was concerned. That's why I'm sorry I actually have left some of what I left behind, because I had dug out a number of quotations from him over the years on Ireland as a bilingual society. Bilingualism is what he's focused on. But that, of course, means that Irish has to have equal status and equal fluency in the mouths of the people as English. It's not a nominal status, a nominal bilingualism he's looking for, it's a real bilingualism. And he writes quite a lot. On Clive Sullish from 1905 to 1907, indeed into 1908, has a lot of Pearse on Belgian education. And he's writing very seriously about it. So all that area tends to be marginalized when one comes to look at Pearse as the 1916 man. You can agree or disagree with what he's writing, that's a different matter. It's actually very interesting in my view. He's didactic, but didactic is what he is, but he's also full of interesting ideas, and he's wide open to interesting ideas. And when he's replying to Perrin, say 1910, which again I was going to quote from, I think it was Sheila Humphreys who was writing about what sort of education does St. Enda's give. The response is St. Enda's gives the best type of modern education. Now, modern education can mean different things, but he goes on to explain what he means by it. And he says, it's quite extraordinary when one pictures him as this very narrow-minded didact, which is the way he's sometimes presented, about the whole Gaelic perspective. He's basically, we must teach literature in English and Irish. We must teach in both languages, and we must go beyond those if we can. There's quite a bit of teaching of French in St. Enda's. We must go beyond those if we can. You don't have to denounce anything English. Now, he himself was no laggard denouncing things English from time to time. You don't have to denounce things English, just praise things Irish. You don't have to denounce foreign games, just play your own. You don't have to denounce foreign language. Use your own, and then as well as it. It's a very different image of Pearse as an educationist. And in that letter to Mrs. Humphreys I'm talking about, which Seamus O'Boole has published, Pearse's letters are published, he's talking as St. Enda's being a school of the modern type. He's going down the reasons of what he means by modern school, etc. And actually, it sounds quite almost contemporary. It is not, they must acquire a absolute command of Irish and their first few weeks or whatever it is, as their first prerequisite, is we teach as we go along. It's a very balanced. He goes so far as to say, you cannot have an all-Irish school nowadays. And if you could, you shouldn't have. Now, this is not Pearse reneging on Irish, obviously, but it is bringing a very different perspective to what linguistic language education ought to be in his idea of the ideal school. As I say, I'm sorry I don't have the quotation, but they're quite long quotations actually. He's quite intent on St. Enda's being cutting edge in terms of what he regards as the most modern approach to education in Europe. And where that happens to coincide with what's happening in England, he has no problem whatsoever with learning from there. It's a very open-minded approach. Now, you can see a distinct shift in Pearse's stylistic behaviour, I put it like that, and Pearse's propagandistic behaviour. Once he decides that with patently home rule not going to be delivered, and he decided that in 1913, he says UVF, etc., will not be blocked, it will not be stopped. If we get anything, it'll be the hind leg of whatever is left over. Therefore, if we were to have anything approaching a United Ireland, and if we were to have anything approaching an Irish Ireland, even though, as I've just been saying, it doesn't mean exclusively Irish Ireland, then we have to look at alternative methods. Now, he's not saying that in 1913, unlike some of the IRB people, to say as an alternative or as the only way out. He's saying if home rule can be got, then it's our duty to get it. But if it transpires it can't be got, then we have to have a fallback position. And even though his language in 1914, actually 13 and 14, but then 13 he's trying to work his way in to IRB perception of him as a possible recruit. By 14 he's in there and he's very rapidly climbing the various organisational ladders in the IRB. The speed of Pearse's rise within the IRB to being a key figure in the organisation, in the planning of the rising, etc., is quite extraordinary. He was no dull when it came to committee work in that sense whatsoever. But into 1915, he's still saying, if home rule can be got, and this is after the, John Redmond has decided he's not going to be a cabinet member, etc., etc. If it can still be got, then it is our duty to get it in that way. Now he does go on to say, those of us who believe that it cannot be got that way have a duty to prepare an alternative. But if home rule can be got, our duty is to establish an Irish party, not an Irish language party, an Irish party, it means a Republican party, within a home rule parliament. And it is, as I see it, only as those possibilities in his mind have gone completely, as 1915 progresses, that he drops what I might call the dual track approach, which was we have to try and build up the volunteers, well parallel, wondering if, maybe hoping, maybe not, but wondering if some concessions can be got along the parliamentary route. It's quite clear to him, it would be to anybody, nothing's going to happen before the end of the war. By late 15, the war is not going to be over for quite some time. And then the time horizon begins to contract very sharply. Plus the fact that some progress is being made with the Germans, because there's no point having a rising, which there wasn't except on purely the psychological grounds on which it was finally held, plus the fact that we're all going to be arrested in a couple of days anyway. So it's it seems to me, a much more interesting, much more multi-layered build-up in that mindset, which is not Devoy's mindset, not Tom Clark's mindset, is not Sean Diarmuid's mindset, is not the close circle around Tom Clark, who are very suspicious of Pearse precisely for those reasons. It's Clark who says, I see something in him that brings added value to us. Not exactly using those words, but that's the sentiment. And it's Clark who was, I don't want to say dictator of the IRB, but was clearly the person who would not be opposed by others within the IRB. It was Clark who brings him in and promotes him subsequently. And I'm pretty certain, even though it doesn't come out collectively, proposes him as president, when he himself could actually have had that. So, while I don't think Tom Clark, because the words aren't there, he doesn't have the command of language that Pearse has, his disposition towards Pearse is absolutely crucial, it seems to me, in determining the outlines of what actually happened. He couldn't predict the detail, obviously. He couldn't predict how the British would play into, in a sense, almost Pearse's hands in certain ways. But the thinking, Clark's thinking, has to be reconstructed as far as possible, or at least has to be addressed in terms of how is that compatible with what we know, with what actually happened. That's not conclusive, obviously. And there's always a danger of the wish being fall of the thought, etc., etc. But it seems to me that in digging more, and we have more digging to do. Now, most of, as far as I can see, what's being said in the public prints about 1916 are reflections on the consequences of, and what would have happened if only it hadn't happened. Right? Now, some of those who know what would have happened if it hadn't happened aren't actually all that clear of what was the it that happened. So, going from the basis of not being absolutely certain about what actually happened, they know exactly what would have happened if what hadn't happened. That deserves to be brought out as well, and I suspect in due course will be. But it's interesting to see the range of responses to, the range of assumptions in responding to alternative scenarios. Now, I don't know how long I've been talking for, and I could go on ad nauseam. What time is it behind me? Is there a clock behind? It's 7 o'clock. In that case, I've been talking too long. You spoke for a while as well, so blame yourself. All right. Listen, we'll take questions or something like that, okay? I'm sure there was a conclusion. We'll forget about that. Thank you very much. You've been a lovely audience for listening. Now, ask questions anything you want to. Now, let me say one more thing. I see I brought a bit of paper with me. It wasn't what I meant to bring with me. It's very interesting to look at, talking about ourselves, by the way. Look at the Irish media nowadays. But I suspect the media in every country, in their own way. This is the Irish Times of, 7th of March. And this is a book Keith Jeffries reviewing Kevin Myers on, etc., and Roy's Ulster Trial, that's something else. In praise of the fighting, and dying, Irish. Right? The one thing you very rarely see in the commentaries of either the Irish or the British is that they are actually engaged in any killing. Now, Gallipoli is being remembered just at the moment. Gallipoli was a mess of the first order, obviously. Remember what it was a mess for? It was a mess to bring Russia into the Straits. It was a mess to relax the pressure on Russia on the Eastern Front, and to get the Russians able to come down and have, whatever it was called at the time, fall to them. It was essentially to take Turkey out of the war, and which the main beneficiary was going to be Russia. Russia was under quite a bit of pressure at that time. And think of what happened to Turkey, or what was intended to happen to Turkey after the war. Obviously, Gallipoli didn't work out as planned. Mind you, the death figures for Gallipoli are frightening. I haven't got them exactly on me, you may have, David, but it's something like 150,000, 160,000 on the Allied side. That's to say, there are two Allied sides, but that's never mentioned. On the Allied side, it's over 200,000 Turks, because Mustafa Kemal, later Kemal Ataturk, remarkable personality, extraordinary personality, but Mustafa Kemal had simple, tactical techniques. You line them up and you charge. And the poor guys from Anatolia, were just working out that there'd be bullets coming at them, from the bullets and got them. But if enough of them charged, they'll get there in the end. But well over 200,000 Turks are killed. But the Allies' plan for Turkey at the end of the war was partition. There would be a Greek zone, there would be an Italian zone, there would be a French zone, there would be an English zone. Now, Mustafa Kemal, who became Ataturk, had different ideas, and because nobody had their heart in continuing to fight after Kemal Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal made it clear that there would be a hell of a fight. He comes out of the east and perpetrates extraordinary savages on the Greeks in Smyrna and all that sort of stuff, but nobody is going to take him on. So Turkey actually emerges as the Turkey more or less of today as a result of Probably indirectly as a result of Gallipoli. You couldn't have done it or been there to do it if Gallipoli had worked. But if Gallipoli had worked, we'd have a very different, or could have a very different Eastern European situation. The war, the things that didn't happen, that were meant to happen, are things that historians tend to overlook, particularly if it involves one's own side. And if, of course, the Middle East, if the Eastern Front had worked out, it was meant to work out, you wouldn't have had the Sykes-Picot plan. You wouldn't have had what I can only call the total shambles in the Middle East ever since. You might have another shambles, by the way. But if you're going to have the Middle East as a shambles by straight lines being drawn on maps by chaps who hardly know which is from which side of it, that is a recipe for shambolic consequences. As I say, the alternative is not necessarily, all living happily ever after, but you can plausibly suggest it would have been, at worst, an alternative shambles, and might not even have been that much of a shambles. Who knows?